The image is almost unbearable to describe, yet it is the only honest place where this story can begin. A small child, barely 2 years old, sits on the cold floor of a narrow hallway, his tiny hands still wrapped around a plastic toy car. His clothes are stained with blood that does not belong to him. His face is blank, emptied of understanding, untouched by the horror that surrounds him. Only a few inches away, his mother lies motionless in a widening pool of red, the silence of the room broken only by the slow, rhythmic drip of blood on the linoleum tiles. It is the kind of scene that forces even seasoned investigators to pause before they step forward. This was the apartment numbered 302 in a working-class residential block in Nagoya. On an ordinary Saturday afternoon in 1999, it became the center of a tragedy that would haunt an entire prefecture. When the landlord pushed open the door, guided by a faint metallic smell that drifted through the hallway, he froze at the threshold. The door had not been forced. The windows were closed. Nothing appeared out of place except for the terrible stillness inside. In the middle of it all sat a child who had witnessed more than any human being should. The victim was Takao Namiko, a young mother known among her neighbors for her gentle manner and quiet dedication to her family. She had spent the morning caring for her son, who had been running a mild fever. Hours later, she was found fatally wounded, her life taken with a level of precision that suggested both intent and frenzy. The killer had vanished without leaving a single identifiable trace visible to the naked eye. What remained were fragments, a strange shoe print, droplets of blood belonging to someone else, and the haunting absence of a motive. At first glance, it seemed like a case that demanded immediate answers. Instead, it became one of Japan's most confounding mysteries. Over the next 26 years, more than 100,000 investigative assignments would be carried out, and thousands of interviews would be conducted. Files grew thicker, theories multiplied, and hope diminished. The trail grew so cold that many believed the truth would never rise to the surface again. Yet the heart of this story does not lie only in the brutality of the crime, but in the man who refused to let it fade. While experts debated dead ends and aging evidence, Takao Umi, Namiko's husband, made a decision that would alter the destiny of the investigation. He preserved the apartment as if time itself had been ordered to stop inside those walls. He paid for it with his savings, his strength, and decades of unwavering faith. The tragedy began in silence. The truth would also emerge from silence. And in that fragile space between grief and perseverance, justice waited for its moment to speak. The hours that led to the tragedy seemed painfully ordinary, a sequence of small domestic moments that should have passed without consequence. For Takao Umi, the morning of October 13th began with the quiet ritual of preparing for work, while his wife tried to soothe their son's mild fever. He remembered her voice at the doorway, soft yet steady, saying that she would take the boy to the clinic and that he should return early if he could. Nothing in her expression warned him that these would be the last words they shared. He would later revisit that moment countless times, searching for some sign that danger had been approaching. There was none. Life in its most devastating form often arrives without a sound. While Umi traveled across the city to respond to an urgent matter at his company, Namiko continued her mourning with the calm precision that those who knew her often described. She called the community clinic to ask how to care for a child with a fever. Her voice, according to the receptionist, sounded polite and untroubled. Later, she contacted Mama no Tomo, the childcare support center she trusted, to arrange a vehicle for the afternoon in case she needed to bring her son to the pediatric hospital. These mundane details would become crucial anchors in the timeline of the investigation, but none of them suggested fear or distress. She moved through the morning with the attentiveness of a young mother who wanted only to keep her child comfortable. Shortly after 9:30, a delivery man arrived with baby formula and diapers. He rang the bell several times but received no answer, eventually leaving a notice slip in the door. The signature and timestamp on his form placed him firmly within the investigative timeline, providing one more piece of clarity about Namiko's movements. At 10:12 and again at 10:40, the childcare center attempted to call her, but both calls went unanswered. Staff members assumed she was tending to her son and did not read anything unusual into the silence. By 11 o'clock, neighbors observed Namiko carrying her son toward the Ogawa Pediatric Clinic. Inside the building, nurses remembered her attentive questions and the way she wrote down every instruction in her notebook. The doctor diagnosed a seasonal viral cold and prescribed medication. The clinic's surveillance camera recorded her departure at 11:42, showing her walking steadily with her son resting on her shoulder. Nothing in her manner suggested the danger that awaited her less than an hour later. Around noon, she stopped at a small shop beneath her apartment building to buy bottled water and wet tissues. She asked the shopkeeper to watch her son briefly while she purchased a warm milk drink from a vending machine. Her receipt from the store and the electronic log from the machine confirmed these minutes with meticulous accuracy. She returned home shortly afterward, unaware that these would be the final documented moments of her life. Just after 12:15, a neighbor in the adjacent unit heard a heavy thud, followed by a sharp, abbreviated cry. It lasted no more than a second or two and then vanished into silence. The neighbor hesitated, assuming that a chair or toy had fallen. The sound troubled her, but she convinced herself that it was part of the ordinary noise of family life. Later, she would tell investigators that she wished she had knocked on the door, even though she knew the tragedy had unfolded too swiftly for anyone to intervene. What happened inside the apartment between 12:15 and the moment the landlord arrived remained a devastating void in the investigation. The struggle ended quickly, with a ferocity that indicated a sudden collapse of control rather than prolonged violence. While forensic reports would later fill in parts of the sequence, the emotional weight of that narrow window in time rested most heavily on Umi. The idea that he had been miles away, unaware that the world he loved was falling apart, became a burden he carried in silence for years. Shortly before 1 o'clock, the landlord approached the apartment with a jar of homemade persimmon jam, meant as a simple thank you gesture for Namiko's help with a delivery the previous day. When he noticed that the door was slightly ajar, an uneasy chill passed through him. The metallic scent in the air gave him an immediate sense that something had gone terribly wrong. His calls into the apartment went unanswered. What he saw as he stepped inside forced him backward against the wall. He fumbled with his phone, dialing the police only after several frantic attempts. Within 20 minutes, officers from the Aichi Prefectural Police arrived with the equipment available at that time. They secured the building, dividing it into an inner investigative zone and an outer perimeter, allowing no one without authorization to enter or leave. The apartment's interior, though small and modest, instantly became a site of intense scrutiny. The investigators noted the absence of forced entry. The struggle appeared contained to the hallway. A trail of blood led toward the bathroom, where faint traces of another person's blood remained in the sink. This detail indicated that the assailant had injured themselves during the crime and attempted to clean the wound before fleeing. The discovery of shoe prints near the entrance marked one of the most distinctive early clues. The prints belonged to a pair of limited-edition women's shoes from South Korea, a style rare in Japan at the time. The size and tread pattern were clear enough to be documented, offering investigators one tangible path forward. Near the dining table, they found a partially consumed yogurt drink bearing 3 fingerprints that did not match those of any family member. Although forensic capabilities in 1999 could identify blood type rather than a complete DNA profile, the samples confirmed that the blood found at the scene was type B, unlike Namiko's type A. As officers worked, one of them lifted the child gently from the hallway. The boy clutched his toy car and stared without speaking. Umi would later arrive to find a cluster of officers blocking the doorway and a silence so profound that he felt as though the air itself resisted his attempts to breathe. When they guided him inside, his legs buckled beneath the weight of what he saw. His wife lay where the investigators had found her, and his son, shaken but unharmed, reached out to him with small hands still touched by blood. The impact of that moment did not settle like a single blow. It spread inward, slowly and mercilessly carving a fault line that altered the course of his entire life. For the officers on scene, the technical aspects of the investigation would become a long and arduous undertaking. But for Umi, the hours after the discovery unfolded with an unreal clarity, as if time had slowed to preserve every detail that he wished desperately to forget. He answered their questions, followed their instructions, and tried to focus on the living child in his arms, even while the presence of death hovered over every corner of the apartment. From the earliest minutes of the investigation, one truth crystallized for him. Someone had entered their home deliberately, had taken his wife's life, and had walked away without leaving a name. The absence of that name would become the central void around which his next 26 years would turn. The apartment that had once held the soft rhythm of a young family became an unnerving stillness after the crime. The doorframe, the hallway, and the living room remained frozen at a moment in time, untouched except by investigators and later by a father who would return month after month with the discipline of someone fighting against erosion. For Takayo Umi, the rooms no longer felt like a place where life had happened. They became a shrine to the truth. The grief he carried hardened into a single purpose. Nothing inside those walls could be allowed to disappear, because anything that vanished might take the identity of the assailant with it. When the forensic team explained how fragile evidence could be, Umi listened with an intensity that startled the officers. According to their reports, bloodstains could break down under light, humidity could degrade trace DNA, and even air circulation could loosen particles that held microscopic clues. The instructions they gave him were procedural, yet he absorbed them with the devotion of a man learning how to preserve the last link to the person he had lost. They taught him how to check the humidity level, how to replace desiccant packs, and how to avoid disturbing the protective film that covered the shoe impressions near the entrance. These techniques were meant for trained personnel, not for a grieving husband. Still, he accepted every step as if he had been waiting his entire life to receive them. The monthly visits began quietly. He would unlock the door, step into the dim hallway, and inhale the stagnant air. At first, he tried not to look at the corner where the investigators had found his wife. Later, he forced himself to look, believing that he owed her that much. He replaced desiccants, checked the windows, dusted the protective film, and recorded every change in a notebook that he kept folded in his jacket pocket. He completed each task quickly, almost mechanically, but the emotional toll accumulated like sediment. Each visit reminded him that he was aging, while the scene inside remained suspended at the moment of loss. By the second year, the apartment had already consumed him. His friends expressed concern. His family feared that the task was wearing away at his health. Yet he continued, driven by a conviction that felt as immovable as stone. He understood that investigative technology was advancing every year. What the authorities could not detect in 1999 might become visible in 2001, 2005, or even decades later. This belief steadied him. If he stopped, he would be abandoning the only chance of uncovering the truth. That possibility was unbearable. The forensic team returned periodically, applying newly imported luminol solutions and more sensitive detection reagents. In 2002, they discovered microscopic traces of blood that had gone unnoticed before, lodged in the tiny gaps of the entryway floor. The confirmation that these traces matched the blood type B found earlier reinforced Umi's resolve. Even the smallest discovery reassured him that time had not defeated the case. He understood that each new breakthrough depended on the preservation of the scene. His role, though unofficial, had become essential. Outside the apartment, life moved in long, uneven stretches. He watched his son grow from a toddler who could not comprehend the word loss into a boy who asked why they handed out flyers every November. Umi answered gently, choosing his words with care so the child would not be burdened by fear. The flyers displayed Nameko's photograph, the year of the crime, and a request for information. At first, only a few people stopped to listen. Later, as the years passed, strangers recognized Umi by sight. Some approached with sympathy, others with cautious respect. His persistence transformed him into an emblem of the families of unresolved cases. During the 5th year, he learned about the legal limitation that threatened to erase everything he had fought for. The statute of limitations, which placed a 15-year deadline on homicide prosecutions, would allow the perpetrator to escape accountability if the case remained unsolved. When he read this, something inside him fractured. The idea that the law itself could deny justice felt more unbearable than the passage of time. The criminal might never face a courtroom, not because evidence was lacking, but because the law had not been designed for the endurance of modern forensic science. That realization ignited a new purpose in him. He reached out to families from other unsolved cases. Many shared the same quiet exhaustion etched into their voices. Together, they formed a coalition and began collecting signatures on the streets of Nagoya and Tokyo. Yumi, who had once spoken very little, now addressed crowds, government officials, and committees with a steady conviction. He described the impact of unresolved cases on surviving families and emphasized how scientific advancements could uncover the truth long after the crime. His efforts were not driven by anger. They were grounded in an unwavering belief that justice should not have an expiration date. For 6 years, he traveled between prefectures, submitting petitions, attending hearings, and speaking to anyone willing to listen. When the Japanese Diet amended the law in 2010 and abolished the statute of limitations for homicide, Umi felt a shift inside him that he could not name. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was a solemn acknowledgement that the fight had entered a new phase. The law would no longer close the door on the truth. Yet the truth still waited, silent and hidden, somewhere beyond reach. His son was 12 years old when he helped distribute flyers during a winter morning marked by the season's first snowfall. The boy's fingers reddened in the cold, but his posture remained firm as he bowed to passers-by and asked for information. That memory stayed with Umi for years, not because of the hardship, but because it signaled that grief had passed from one generation to the next. He had tried to protect his son from the weight of the past. Instead, the boy had chosen to shoulder it beside him. As time pushed forward, the investigation slowed. The original task force of 50 detectives dwindled to 10, then 3. The case became a cold file, reviewed occasionally but no longer active. Still, Umi continued his monthly visits. He noticed the dust that gathered easily, the way the light from the hallway bulb dimmed year after year, and the subtle changes in his own face reflected in the window glass. His hair grayed. His hands trembled slightly when he wrote in the notebook. Yet he persisted, guided by an intuition that the truth had not been lost, only waiting. By the 20th year, even he could feel that time was winning. His son had entered adulthood, married, and begun to build a life that did not revolve entirely around the tragedy. Yumi encouraged this. He understood that grief should not imprison a second generation. But he also knew that he himself could not step away. He had sacrificed his savings to continue renting the apartment. The cumulative cost reached tens of millions of yen, an amount that would have seemed impossible to justify under any other circumstance. Yet every payment felt like an investment in the future moment when the evidence would speak. The turning point came unexpectedly in 2024, when new forensic equipment capable of analyzing highly degraded DNA samples became available. This development revived the investigative team, leading them to re-examine overlooked materials, including a counselor's note from when Umi's son was 4. The note contained a child's recollection about a woman from a convenience store. It was a vague statement, easily dismissed decades earlier. Now it became the beginning of a renewed pursuit. As the authorities reopened old files, cross-checked personnel records, and reanalyzed blood samples with new technology, momentum returned to the case. It did not erase the 26 years that had passed, but it reshaped them. Each discovery validated the painful discipline that Umi had maintained in the apartment. Evidence preserved by his hands gradually revealed a path toward the truth. He would not know it yet, but the moment he had been waiting for was approaching. After 26 years of silence, the evidence that had remained in that untouched hallway was finally ready to speak. The investigation began to shift in late 2024, not because of a sudden confession or a forgotten witness, but because forensic science had finally advanced enough to confront the silence that had endured for 26 years. New DNA extraction systems capable of isolating genetic material from degraded samples offered an opportunity that the original investigators could only have imagined. The prefectural police initiated a broad re-examination of cold cases, and the murder of Takao Namiko was among the first files selected. The aging evidence from the apartment, preserved for decades with meticulous discipline, was now ready for a different kind of scrutiny. The forensic division began with materials collected in 1999, the microscopic blood particles embedded in the entryway floor, the samples from the bathroom sink, and the organic residues clinging to dust captured under protective film. Each of these items had been stored systematically, yet the preservation inside the apartment had provided the most promising sources. When technicians applied the new equipment, the sensors registered faint but significant signals, fragments of genetic markers that had not been detectable under previous technology. The data showed promise, but the sample quality remained too compromised for a full profile. A different approach was required. During the reassessment of archived documents, a young investigator named Chikiriko reviewed counseling notes from 2001. According to these notes, the child, then 4 years old, had once described a woman from a convenience store whose hand was bleeding during the day of the crime. At the time, this statement had been dismissed because the identity of the woman was unclear, and the child's recollection was considered unreliable. However, combined with the newly detected fibers resembling packaging materials commonly used in convenience stores, the note gained renewed significance. It suggested the possibility of a completely different investigative path, one that connected the assailant not to Namiko's social sphere, as previously assumed, but to Umi's past. The turning point emerged when Detective Sun Taisuke examined the case with the perspective of an investigator who had spent decades confronting procedural blind spots. He noted that the team had focused primarily on Namiko's acquaintances and immediate contacts, yet the mention of a convenience store employee implied a broader network connected indirectly through Umi. The detective proposed revisiting the husband's past relationships, including those predating his marriage, to identify individuals who might have held unresolved emotional attachments or grievances. This line of inquiry led to a set of alumni records from a high school reunion held in 1998, 1 year before the murder. Among the signatures was a name that had long escaped scrutiny: Anfu Kimiko. The alumni message she wrote mentioned Umi directly, describing the reunion as bringing back memories as if it were yesterday. Cross-referencing her address history revealed a series of unusual changes. She had moved residences shortly after the crime, altered her employment records, and severed communication with former classmates. Combined with the child's recollection, the details aligned with investigative patterns associated with avoidance behavior. However, suspicion alone was insufficient. A tangible genetic link was required. In 2025, the Japanese Forensic Network adopted an expanded system of kinship DNA comparison, which allowed investigators to match degraded crime scene samples with relatives of potential suspects whose genetic data had been collected for unrelated reasons. When the police reviewed Kimiko's family registry, they identified her nephew, Kenta, who had provided DNA during a traffic-related injury investigation in 2023. The database search produced an immediate alert. A partial match indicated that Kenta shared maternally inherited markers consistent with the degraded sample extracted from the apartment. The result did not identify the assailant directly, but the probability of a close maternal relative being connected to the crime was exceedingly high, according to the forensic analysts. With this breakthrough, the focus of the investigation shifted decisively toward Kimiko. Surveillance was initiated discreetly to avoid premature confrontation. The team monitored her daily routines, movements, and interactions, building a case that required both precision and caution. On October 12, 2025, detectives visited her residence under the pretext of collecting supplementary information regarding her nephew's traffic incident. Kimiko opened the door wearing a dark-colored sleepwear set, appearing composed yet guarded. As the questioning progressed, investigators noticed a faint scar, approximately 2 centimeters in length, running across the second knuckle of her left index finger. The injury was old but consistent with a laceration caused by a blade. When they requested a buccal swab to verify familial association, she paused for nearly a minute before asking an unexpected question, whether the request was related to the case from 26 years ago. The investigators maintained procedural neutrality, but the question indicated awareness that exceeded what had been disclosed. Kimiko ultimately complied with the sampling procedure. The swab was delivered immediately to the forensic laboratory, where analysts conducted a full genetic comparison. The results were completed in the evening of October 29th. The match was unequivocal. The degraded DNA from the apartment and Kimiko's profile aligned completely, excluding the possibility of coincidence. The evidence was not suggestive. It was definitive. The following morning, Detective Makimoto contacted her and requested her presence at the precinct to assist in verifying details related to the reopened case. There was no coercion. No officers arrived at her home. Instead, she agreed to appear voluntarily. When she entered the station on October 31st, she was carrying a worn fabric bag and wearing the same deep blue coat she had worn to the reunion in 1998. She presented her identification and stated calmly that she had come to confess. Inside the interrogation room, Kimiko described a sequence of events that aligned with forensic and temporal data gathered over the years. She explained that she had visited the apartment under the pretense of offering a gift related to childcare, having previously learned of Namiko's involvement with a civic support group. According to her account, the encounter escalated emotionally when she saw a family photograph displayed inside the unit. Her recollection did not describe deliberate planning, but acknowledged an intense surge of emotion, followed by actions that corresponded with observed injuries at the scene. The cut on her finger, the traces of blood in the bathroom sink, and the shoe impressions matched her narrative. Her statements did not embellish details and remained consistent with evidence collected from the beginning of the investigation. Once her confession had been recorded, the investigative chronology achieved a clarity that had eluded authorities for more than 2 decades. The fibers found in the soil beneath the shoe prints corresponded with packaging used by convenience stores where she had worked. The yogurt drink container bearing foreign fingerprints aligned with her movements. The partial DNA sample that had persisted, protected for 26 years, now converged with modern forensic technology to complete the case. For the detectives who had carried the file across phases of their careers, the conclusion brought a sense of gravity rather than relief. One investigator, already in his 80s, received the news while hospitalized and reportedly wept upon hearing that the suspect had been identified and apprehended. The culmination of the investigation was not defined by triumph, but by the weight of persistence shared by the police who had spent their lives confronting unresolved questions. In the days that followed, the prefectural police assembled a public briefing that compiled the investigative procedure, forensic breakthroughs, and the timeline that led to Kimiko's arrest. The emphasis remained on the patience required for long-term evidence preservation and the decisive role that scientific innovation had played in reopening a path that had once seemed permanently closed. For the family, however, the moment carried a different meaning. After 26 years of uncertainty, the truth had emerged not through chance, but through endurance. The evidence that had survived inside the apartment, guarded by a father who refused to allow time to erase what mattered, had ultimately aligned with a technology capable of extracting its final message. The silence of the crime scene had lasted for decades. Now it had spoken with absolute clarity. The arrest of Anfu Kimiko did not bring celebration. Justice in a case that has lasted more than 2 decades seldom arrives with triumph. Instead, it steps forward with gravity, carrying the quiet weight of the years that have passed. When investigators confirmed the DNA match and documented her confession, the conclusion of the case carried a tone of solemn clarity. There were no unanswered questions about the evidence. There was no ambiguity in the chain of events. The truth, once obscured by time and silence, emerged with unmistakable precision. For the Takao family, the final discovery marked the end of a long and unforgiving chapter. The resolution did not erase the pain carved into their lives, nor did it restore what had been taken from them. Yet it delivered something that had felt impossible for many years: the assurance that Namiko's story would not remain suspended in uncertainty. Her life would not be reduced to an unresolved file or a fragmented collection of theories. Her case would close on the foundation of verifiable facts, established with scientific rigor and corroborated by a full investigative record. As the prefectural police reviewed the 26-year timeline, they emphasized that the conclusion resulted from persistence rather than coincidence. Advanced forensic technology provided the means, but preservation gave the evidence its path to speak. The apartment remained intact because a husband refused to allow the details of his wife's final moments to fade. The officers acknowledged that without this dedication, the degraded DNA would likely have lost all viability long before it could be analyzed. Their public report outlined the rare convergence of personal endurance and scientific progress that made the resolution possible. For Umi, the closing of the case held a dual significance. On one hand, it fulfilled the vow he made on the day of Namiko's funeral, a promise to uncover the truth regardless of how long it required. On the other, it forced him to confront the reality that the pursuit itself had shaped nearly half of his life. Every visit to the apartment, every petition he signed, every step he took through snow-covered streets distributing flyers had been undertaken with the belief that persistence could transform absence into evidence. Now, with the truth confirmed, he stood before the same door that he had opened month after month, no longer as a guardian of the past but as a witness to its conclusion. The legal process that awaited Kimiko would proceed with the procedural integrity required by Japanese law. Her confession, corroborated thoroughly by forensic and circumstantial data, placed responsibility for the crime directly upon her actions. The state would determine the appropriate sentence. Yet the moral dimension of the case did not require judicial interpretation. The consequences of the act extended far beyond the courtroom. They shaped the life of a child, altered the trajectory of a family, and influenced national discussions about the statute of limitations for violent crime. These impacts, though intangible, formed part of the case's lasting legacy. When the police finally removed the protective film covering the shoe impressions in the entryway, the marks remained clearly visible despite the passage of years. The reddish-brown stain on the floor had darkened, but it retained the silent testimony of the struggle that had occurred. As the afternoon light entered the apartment for the first time in decades, the space shifted from an active crime scene into a preserved memory. It no longer held the responsibility of protecting evidence. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The story of the case does not end with closure alone. It stands as an assertion that time does not automatically defeat truth. It shows that scientific advancement, paired with human resolve, can reach back across decades to clarify what once seemed unreachable. Above all, it affirms that justice, though delayed, can arrive with a force strong enough to reshape the meaning of the years that preceded it.